Chapter 1. The Mysterious Package. Zoe Perez wasn't expecting any deliveries when a small, unmarked package arrived at her doorstep. Puzzled, she picked it up, feeling its light weight. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in uneven handwriting. A strange chill crawled up her spine. With growing curiosity, she took it inside and carefully unwrapped the box. Inside was a doll. It was an antique porcelain doll with a pale, cracked face and glassy blue eyes that seemed too lifelike. Its auburn hair was slightly tangled, and it wore a faded blue dress with lace trimmings. Something about the doll made Zoe uneasy, but she dismissed it as paranoia. Maybe it was a prank from one of her friends? Shrugging, she placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom and went about her evening. But as she lay in bed later that night, she had this strange sensation of being watched. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Zoe rolled onto her side, telling herself it was just her imagination. Yet, the feeling persisted, like unseen eyes locked onto her. Finally, she huffed and sat up, scanning the darkened room. The doll sat on the shelf, its glossy eyes catching the dim light from the street lamp outside. Shaking her head, she reached for her phone and sent a quick message to her best friend Lily. "Hey, did you send me a creepy doll as a joke?" A few moments later, the dots on the screen wiggled, signaling Lily was typing. "What? No. What doll?" Zoe frowned. "Weird. Someone left it on my doorstep. No note, no return address. Just my name. Okay, that's unsettling. Did you check for anything inside it?" Zoe hadn't thought of that. Antique dolls sometimes had hidden compartments. Feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension, she climbed out of bed and retrieved the doll. It felt colder than before, as if it had been sitting in ice water. She turned it over in her hands, running her fingers over the cracks in its face, the delicate stitching of its dress. Then she noticed something strange. The back of the dress had been sewn shut with thick black thread, contrasting starkly against the delicate blue fabric. Her pulse quickened. Taking a small pair of scissors from her desk drawer, she snipped the stitches carefully. A tiny, yellowed piece of paper was folded inside, brittle with age. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it and squinted at the faded writing. "Do not keep her." A chill washed over Zoe. Her eyes darted to the doll's eerily frozen expression, as if it knew she had read the note. She swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. "Okay, this is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, stuffing the paper into her nightstand drawer. Determined to ignore the weirdness, she placed the doll back on the shelf, turned off the lights, and crawled into bed. The doll couldn't actually be dangerous. It was just an old toy. A prank. Nothing more. But as the hours crept by, sleep wouldn't come easily. The night was unusually still. No distant car horns, no chirping crickets, just an oppressive silence that settled over the room like a thick fog. Every creak of the house sent her heart into overdrive. Then she heard it. A soft rustling sound, like fabric shifting. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. She strained her ears, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. Her eyes flicked toward the shelf. The doll was gone. A cold, electric fear jolted through her veins. She scrambled for her bedside lamp, flicking it on. The warm glow flooded the room, revealing the doll. It was no longer on the shelf, but lying face up on her nightstand, glassy blue eyes staring directly at her. Zoe gasped, her pulse hammering in her ears. She was alone in the house. There was no way the doll could have moved by itself. Shakily, she grabbed it, resisting the urge to throw it across the room. "This is insane," she whispered. Maybe it had fallen? Maybe she placed it there absent-mindedly and forgotten? But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Her hands trembled as she shoved the doll back onto the shelf, turning it so it faced the wall. Then, without another thought, She pulled her blankets over her head like a child hiding from a monster and forced her eyes shut. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, her breathing evened out. The exhaustion of the day won over, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. But as the night stretched on, the whispers began. At first, they were too soft to distinguish, a barely there murmur in the darkness. Then they grew clearer, a child's voice, faint, echoing. Zoe. Her eyes flew open, her heart slamming against her ribs. The air in her room felt thick, suffocating. The whisper came again, closer this time, brushing against her ear like a breath. She bolted upright and turned on every light in her room, panting, her gaze darting to the shelf. The doll was facing her again. Zoe clutched her phone with clammy hands and dialed Lily's number. The call rang for what felt like an eternity before a groggy voice answered. Zoe, it's 3 a.m. What's wrong? The doll, she whispered, her throat dry. It moved. I swear it moved. And I heard. A soft thud interrupted her. She whipped her head toward the shelf. The doll had fallen to the floor. But it wasn't just lying there. It was sitting upright. She barely suppressed a scream. Lily, I'm getting rid of it, she said, leaping out of bed. She grabbed the doll, ignoring the icy sensation that seeped into her fingers. Fumbling for a trash bag, she shoved it inside, tying the top tightly. What are you doing? Lily asked, now fully awake. Tossing it in the dumpster. Barefoot and shivering, Zoe rushed outside into the night. The cold air bit at her skin as she jogged to the dumpster behind her apartment complex. She hoisted the bag up and flung it inside, watching it disappear into the darkness. Relief flooded her chest. She didn't care who had sent it. She just wanted it gone. Sighing, she turned to go back inside. But as she reached her door, her blood ran cold. Sitting on her doorstep, perfectly placed, was the doll. And this time it was smiling. Chapter 2: Midnight Movements. The next morning, Zoe awoke to an eerie sight. The doll was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it was sitting on her desk, facing her bed. Its black glass eyes gleamed in the morning light, reflecting a dull, lifeless glow. Her stomach twisted as she tried to recall if she had moved it herself, but she was certain she hadn't. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, half expecting it to be warm, but it was as cold as porcelain should be. Trying to shake the feeling of unease, she placed the doll back on the shelf. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe she had placed it there without remembering. But the next night, the same thing happened. And the night after that. Every morning, the doll had moved closer. First the desk, then the chair by her bed, then one night, right at the foot of her bed. Always staring. Always watching. Zoe started keeping a flashlight under her pillow. Each night, she would grip it tightly as she fell asleep, dreading what she might see if she woke up in the middle of the night. She began to have dreams, or were they dreams, where she swore she heard soft, deliberate footsteps creaking across the wooden floor. Sometimes, she felt something cold brush against her toes, only to wake up in a panic and find nothing there. One evening, she decided to test her sanity. Before going to bed, she placed the doll in the very back of her closet, behind a stack of books and an old shoebox. She shut the closet door tightly, wedging a chair under the knob just in case. The next morning, the chair was undisturbed, but the closet door was open, and the doll sat in the middle of her room. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just forgetfulness. This wasn't something she could rationalize away. Something was moving the doll. That night, she locked her bedroom door. She barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. Could someone be sneaking into her room? A cruel prank from her younger brother? But no, his fear of dolls was even worse than hers. She thought about her parents, but they wouldn't do something like this. and that left the most unsettling possibility of all, that the doll was moving on its own. At 2:47 a.m., she woke up abruptly, heart pounding. The room was silent, but something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl before your brain even registers the danger. She reached under her pillow for the flashlight and clicked it on. Her breath hitched. The doll was sitting on her nightstand, closer than ever before. Zoe shot upright in bed, pressing herself against the headboard. The doll had been in the middle of the room when she went to sleep. How had it moved without her hearing? Her pulse hammered in her ears as she reached out, hesitant, and nudged the doll with a trembling finger. It toppled onto its side. A small sigh of relief escaped her lips. It was just a doll. An old, creepy doll, but a doll nonetheless. She grabbed it with both hands, her fingers gripping the delicate fabric of its Victorian-style dress, and stuffed it into her desk drawer. Then she pulled out a roll of duct tape and wrapped it around the drawer handles several times. It was ridiculous, but she needed to feel some sense of control. That night, she slept better. But the next morning, when she reached for her school books, she froze. The drawer was empty. The duct tape was still in place, unbroken. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She turned, scanning the room, and then she saw it. The doll was sitting on her pillow. She screamed. Her mother rushed in, eyes wide with concern. "Zoe, what's wrong?" Zoe pointed a shaking finger at the doll. It moves, Mom. It keeps moving. I locked it up, and now." Her mother frowned, walking over to the bed and picking up the doll. She turned it over in her hands, inspecting it with the kind of mild curiosity one might show when finding an old childhood toy. "Honey, it's just a doll. Maybe you're moving it in your sleep?" "No." Zoe's voice cracked. "I swear, I put it in my desk. I taped it shut. Mom, please, you have to believe me." Her mother sighed, setting the doll back on the shelf. "Maybe you're stressed. School has been tough lately, right?" Zoe clenched her fists. Why wouldn't anyone believe her? She had to prove it. That night, she set up her phone to record. She angled it perfectly so it would capture the entire room, especially the shelf where the doll sat. Then she forced herself to sleep, knowing she would finally have proof. When she woke up, she felt a chill deep in her bones. The air was thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and played the video. The footage showed her sleeping, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The doll remained still on the shelf. Hours passed with nothing. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the screen glitched. For a split second, the footage distorted, then resumed. And the doll was gone. Zoe's stomach turned to ice. She fast-forwarded, her heart in her throat. At 3:14 a.m., the footage flickered again, and the doll was now sitting on her desk. At 3:16 a.m., another flicker. It was in a chair by her bed. 3:18 a.m., the last flicker, and the doll was inches from her face. Zoe dropped the phone. She scrambled out of bed, backing up to the farthest corner of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The doll sat there, unmoving, but she knew without a doubt, it wasn't just her imagination. She had to get rid of it. She grabbed the doll with both hands and ran. Down the stairs, through the front door, out into the cold night air. She sprinted across the yard and threw the doll into the trash bin, slamming the lid shut. Her entire body was trembling, but she felt a sense of relief. It was over, or so she thought. The next morning, Zoe stepped back into her room, her heart finally steady. And there, sitting on her bed, was the doll, waiting, watching. Chapter 3: A Frightening Discovery. Zoe had enough. She decided to record the night with her phone's camera. If someone was playing a cruel joke, she would catch them. She set up the camera on her nightstand, aimed directly at the doll, and went to sleep. The unease in her stomach churned as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the rhythmic ticking of her bedside clock amplifying her nerves. The doll sat on the shelf, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim glow of the streetlight outside. Even though she tried to reason with herself, perhaps it was just her imagination, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Despite her anxiety, exhaustion eventually took hold, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Zoe woke up with a jolt, her pulse racing as if her body already knew something was wrong. She sat up, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. The screen was still on, the battery drained down to its last few percentages. She hit play. At first, there was nothing but silence. Hours passed in eerie stillness. Her bedroom remained unchanged until just past 3 a.m. That was when it happened. The doll moved. Not slowly, not as if it had simply fallen, but deliberately. Its tiny porcelain head twisted toward the camera in a sharp, mechanical motion, its painted lips frozen in an eternal, eerie smile. Zoe's breath hitched in her throat. Then, in jerky, unnatural movements, the doll climbed down the shelf. Its tiny limbs bent at odd angles as it scuttled across the floor, more insect-like than human. A sense of horror crawled up Zoe's spine. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. And yet it was. The doll stopped at the edge of her bed. It turned its head upward, as if staring directly at her sleeping form. Then, slowly, its head swiveled to face the camera. Zoe's hands clenched into fists as she watched, paralyzed by dread. The doll knew it was being watched. Its movements became erratic, twitching and jerking unnaturally. The video distorted. The screen glitched. Then, blackness. Zoe dropped the phone, her heartbeat a wild, uncontrollable drum against her ribs. Her body trembled violently, sweat forming on her forehead. She scrambled back against her headboard, eyes darting to the shelf where the doll should have been. It wasn't there. The air in the room felt thicker, suffocating. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe it fell? Maybe. But she knew better. Gathering every ounce of courage, she peered over the edge of her bed, her breath caught in her throat. The doll wasn't on the floor. Her pulse thundered. She scanned the dimly lit room, her heart hammering. Then she saw it. The doll sat neatly on her desk, facing her, as if it had been placed there deliberately. As if it had been watching her all night. Zoe let out a strangled gasp, stumbling out of bed and backing against the wall. Every logical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible. Dolls didn't move. They didn't climb. They didn't stare at cameras as if they knew they were being recorded. Her eyes darted back to her phone, still lying on the bed, the screen dark. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she replayed the footage. She had to see it again, had to make sure she wasn't imagining things. But the video file was gone. She scrolled frantically through her gallery. The recording should have been there. It had been there just moments ago. But now, nothing. No trace of it at all. As if it had never existed. A chill ran down her spine. Something was terribly wrong. The air in her room felt colder, heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. The rational part of her mind screamed for her to leave, to throw the doll away, to get out of the house. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, told her she needed to understand what was happening. If she simply ran, would it stop? Would it follow? She had to know. Cautiously, she approached the doll. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against its cold porcelain face. It felt ordinary. Just a doll. And yet, the memory of its movements burned in her mind like a fresh wound. Zoe swallowed hard and picked it up, gripping it tightly, as if expecting it to move again in her hands. But it didn't. It remained motionless, lifeless. She needed help. Someone had to believe her. She grabbed her phone, intending to call her best friend, Emma. As she scrolled through her contacts, a message notification flashed on her screen. You shouldn't have recorded that. Zoe's blood ran cold. Her grip on the phone tightened. The message had no sender, no number, just those 5 chilling words. Her breath came in short gusts as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was someone watching her? Had they somehow erased the footage? Was this all a sick game? She forced herself to type a reply with trembling fingers. Who is this? No response. She looked back at the doll. Its head was tilted slightly now. She was sure, absolutely sure, it hadn't been like that before. Terror coiled around her chest like a vice. She needed to get rid of it. Now, grabbing the doll, she stormed out of her room and down the stairs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She flung open the front door and sprinted to the trash bin. Without hesitation, she threw the doll inside, slamming the lid shut. Her heart pounded as she backed away, staring at the bin, as if expecting the doll to force its way out. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves in an eerie whisper. For a long moment, she stood there unsure, waiting. Then, taking a deep breath, she turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. She exhaled sharply, trying to calm her racing mind. It was over. It had to be over. But deep down, Zoe knew the truth. It wasn't over. And she wasn't safe. Chapter 4. The Final Night. Panic set in. She needed to get rid of it. Grabbing the doll, she stuffed it back into the box and rushed outside. The cool night air bedded her skin as she sprinted toward the trash bin at the end of the driveway. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid and threw the box inside, the sound of it landing against the metal walls echoing in the quiet darkness. She slammed the lid shut, feeling a brief sense of relief wash over her. It was over. She hurried back inside, locking the door behind her. Every shadow in the house seemed to stretch unnaturally, whispering threats her mind couldn't fully comprehend. The clock on the wall read 11:57 p.m. Midnight was approaching. Zoe ascended the stairs with slow, careful steps, as though one wrong move would awaken something unseen. Once inside her bedroom, she locked the door and collapsed onto her bed. Her pulse still thundered in her ears, but exhaustion was quickly taking over. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally freed herself. As she lay in bed, the silence grew heavy, suffocating. Just as her eyelids began to droop, a soft, scratching noise echoed from outside her door. Her breath hitched. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like tiny fingers clawing at the wood. A whisper followed, barely audible, yet unmistakably clear. You can't get rid of me, Zoe. Her blood ran cold. Every muscle in her body locked into place. She turned toward the door, her breath shallow, her heartbeat a deafening drum in her ears. The scratching continued. Long, deliberate strokes against the wood. Tears welled in her eyes as she forced herself to remain still, to listen. Then silence. She stayed awake for what felt like hours, waiting for something else, anything, but no further sound came. Eventually, exhaustion won, and she drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by nightmares of porcelain faces and soulless black eyes. The next morning, she woke to the soft glow of daylight filtering through her curtains. For a moment, she almost convinced herself that it had all been a dream, that the previous night had been nothing more than an exhausted mind playing tricks on her. But then she saw it. The box, neatly placed in front of her bedroom door. Zoe gasped, scrambling backward until she hit the opposite wall. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts as she forced herself to look. The box was perfectly intact, as though it had never been thrown away. Her shaking hands reached for the doorknob. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to burn the house down if necessary, but she had to know. Slowly, she pulled the door open. The box remained motionless, waiting. Heart hammering, she crouched down and hesitantly lifted the lid. The doll was inside, smiling up at her. Her scream caught in her throat as she stumbled back, knocking over a lamp in the process. The doll's glassy eyes stared unblinking, its stitched mouth curled in an eerie grin. Her fingers twitched, itching to throw it away again, to destroy it completely. But something inside her whispered that it would be useless. She grabbed the box and bolted down the stairs, not caring that her bare feet barely made contact with the cold wooden steps. Flinging the front door open, she ran toward the backyard. The fire pit. That was her answer. Without hesitation, she dumped the doll and its box into the pit and grabbed the matches from a nearby shelf. Her hands trembled so violently that it took 3 tries before she could strike a match. The tiny flame flickered to life, dancing in the early morning light. She threw it in. The fire caught instantly, devouring the box in seconds. The wood cracked and splintered, curling in on itself as the flames grew taller. The doll's porcelain face blackened, cracked. Relief flooded through her as she watched the cursed thing turn to ash. Then the laughter began. Low at first, a giggle carried by the wind. It grew louder, warping into a distorted, childlike cackle. Zoe's stomach clenched as she took a step back, her legs suddenly weak. The fire flickered, then died. The pit was empty. No ashes, no charred remains, nothing. A breath of icy air curled around her neck, and a whisper caressed her ear. Nice try. Zoe spun around, heart pounding. The yard was empty. The street beyond was silent, the world seemingly undisturbed by the horror unfolding before her. She ran inside, locking the doors and windows, as if that would do anything. Panic clawed at her chest, suffocating her. What did it want? Why wouldn't it leave her alone? She had to find out. She had to understand. Grabbing her laptop, she searched for anything she could find on cursed dolls, haunted objects, possessions, anything that could explain this nightmare. A name appeared, one repeated across multiple forums, old articles, and personal testimonies. Alara. A doll created in the late 1800s by a grieving mother whose child had died unexpectedly. The stories varied, but they all ended the same way. Anyone who tried to dispose of the doll met a gruesome fate. Some went missing. Others were found in their homes, eyes wide in terror, mouths forever frozen in silent screams. Zoe's breath shuddered as she scrolled down further. Then she froze. There, in an old black and white photo, was a doll. The same doll. Her laptop screen flickered. The lights in her room dimmed. The temperature plummeted. And then she heard it. A creaking sound. Coming from behind her. Slowly, with every ounce of courage she had left, she turned. There, sitting on her bed, was the doll. Closer than before. And this time, it wasn't just smiling. It was watching.